Our speaker today, most of you, I'm sure all of you know her, Lauren Cantatore-Causey. She was born in California, was raised as a Unitarian. She served 21 years in the Coast Guard and has served UTC3 as the Director of Religious Education for 10 years, retiring in 2018. She's been a member of UTC3 since 2005 and lives here with her husband, Michael. They have 5 daughters and a plethora of grandchildren and great-grandchildren. So please welcome Lauren.
Good morning. So last year, our congregations heard a lot about Article 2. Anybody remember hearing about Article 2? What is Article 2? July of this year, Christi Stockman talked a little bit about the Article 2 Study Commission, which led to the revision of the UUA bylaws, and that was presented at the General Assembly of 2024 and was passed by over an 80% margin. Today I'm going to go a little more into depth about the reason behind the revision, including some of the history of changes from the inception of the Unitarians and the Universalists. There's a joke that comes to mind. When a UU comes to a fork in the road with a sign pointing to the right saying, "To God," and another sign pointing left that says, "To discussion of God," the UU will always go to the discussion. One of the defining tenets of our faith is that it is considered a living tradition. If you notice, our hymnal says singing the living tradition. What does that mean exactly? We are not a static faith. We are growing, changing. We are becoming better and braver. This means we periodically need to revisit the things that are most important to us to make sure that they are aligned with the now. In fact, this is so important that the UUA's bylaws mandate that Article 2, which expresses the shared covenant, will be reviewed every 15 years. The Reverend Dr. Michael Tino says, "We do not etch our faith in stone precisely because we hold sacred that it must change. It must adapt to new challenges. It must meet new understandings. And it must evolve on new experiences and connections." As a living tradition, we draw from our 6 sources, which include direct experience, words and deeds of prophetic people, wisdom from the world's religions, Jewish and Christian teachings, humanist teachings, and spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions. So I'm going to share a little history in how we as a faith tradition have changed. Even though the Unitarians and the Universalists didn't consolidate the 2 associations until 1961, as far back as 1865, at a historic Unitarian convention, a resolution was printed with, quote, "looking to union with the Universalist body." So the Universalist Church, the more radical of the 2, believe it or not, was founded in 1793, and one of the tenets was that every person would have salvation, rather than the congregational church views of predestination, which means only a small number, the elect, would be saved. And we don't know how those people were chosen. The American Unitarian Association was founded in 1825 when the Unitarians split from the New England Congregational churches that maintained their Calvinist theology, which was Trinitarian in nature. When the associations decided to consolidate in the late 1950s, there were a host of concerns from both groups. Each faction was concerned about losing its identity and wanted to make sure that the new bylaws would reflect understandings and promises acceptable to both. In an anecdote shared by the Reverend Dr. John Cummins, he recalled one Unitarian matron was heard to sniff that the Universalists were nothing but Baptists that could read, and the Universalists, you'll like this one, complained that Unitarians didn't feel that they'd had a good sermon unless they didn't quite understand it themselves. If you're curious about the details in the process that both groups went through, there's an interesting read online. It's very fascinating. If you type in the Unitarian Universalist merger of 1961 to 1975, it was actually a study commission on the results of the merger 15 years before that. One of the things that struck me was the process in which the vote for the merger was taken. 148,000 plus people from both faith traditions voted. I learned a new word, plebiscite. Anybody know what that means? Lee. Everyone gets a vote. Every one of those people voted. When the two faiths became Unitarian Universalist Association, they forged new bylaws to define their shared principles. Both groups, quote, made freedom of belief and conscience central to their religious convictions, according to Warren R. Ross, who's a contributing editor for the UU World. Here are our original 6 principles. The members of the Unitarian Universalist Association, dedicated to the principles of a free faith, unite in seeking to strengthen one another in a free and disciplined search for truth as the foundation of our religious fellowship, to cherish and spread the universal truths taught by the great prophets and teachers of humanity in every age and tradition, immemorially summarized in the Judeo-Christian heritage as love to God and love to man. To affirm, defend, and promote the supreme worth of every human personality, the dignity of man, and the use of the democratic method in human relationships. To implement our vision of one world by striving for a world community founded on ideals of brotherhood, justice, and peace. To serve the needs of member churches and fellowships, to organize new churches and fellowships, and to extend and strengthen liberal religion. And lastly, to encourage cooperation with men of goodwill in every land. So I'm thinking you can see some similar themes here. There are references to a free faith, search for truth, and our commitment to transforming the world into a better place. Also note inherent worth and dignity, and as I'm sure you've noticed, the language using male gender to refer to all of humanity was typical for its time. But by the 1970s, those of you who grew up in the 70s, think about what was happening in our culture then. UU women and many men were becoming unhappy with the sexist language in the original bylaws. At the 1977 General Assembly, the UU Women's Federation presented a resolution asking for Unitarian Universalists to call on all leaders at all levels of the UUA to make every effort to put traditional assumptions and language into perspective and avoid sexist assumptions and language in the future. So that's a big step. The resolution passed unanimously and was part of a growing force of change during that time, including in the UUA, including the civil rights movement and rights for the LGBTQ community. We were very, very busy during the 70s. Even though our UUA bylaws require that Article 2, which is our principles and purposes, shall be reviewed at least every 15 years, it took several more years to adopt a new set of principles. If you remember earlier, I mentioned our 6 sources. Those were not added until this revision of the bylaws, but the changes didn't just address gender. They made significant language changes that were relevant to the times. The language of God, man, and brotherhood were removed, but the language of interdependence was added. There were considerable concerns, disagreement, resentment during that revision process. But in the end, we came together to adopt these 7 principles in 1985. Since Kirk Newport listed them in his message last week, they should be pretty easy to remember. I'm going to briefly go over them. The inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another, and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, and respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. In 2009, a revised draft of the bylaws was presented at General Assembly, aligning with our every 15 years revisiting. The 2 main items of contention were a perceived watering down of the 6 sources, language that was changed that did not feel sacred to people of the earth-centered traditions specifically, and a couple of others. This was the biggie, though. A new section which was entitled Inclusion, which pledged to do all we can to replace barriers for persons and groups with particular identities, ages, abilities, and histories. This is 1985. We were supposedly kind of woke. The vote wasn't even to include the proposed revision in the bylaws. It was to agree to study the draft for 1 more year to give congregations time to learn and discuss it before a vote in 2010. At the proposed draft study, the delegates rejected it in a very close vote, 573 to 586.
In 2009 or 1985?
This was in, I'm sorry, you're right, in 1985, and then, you're right, in 2010, this was what we were not agreeing on, by half. Let's fast forward to the General Assembly of 2022. An 8th principle was introduced. Does anybody know the verbiage of the 8th principle? There was tons of controversy about this principle. I'm going to read it for you now. We covenant to affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. Proponents felt that even though we address inclusivity and justice for marginalized people implicitly that our faith needed more explicit language, renewing our commitment and to include accountability. Opponents felt that the wording was redundant and awkward, and some argued that if accountability was included in this principle, then it should be included in all of the other principles. Why would we need the word accountability in there? And who are we accountable to? Are we accountable to ourselves, to each other? It was a big to-do. Others were frustrated that the drafters of this resolution had no interest in suggested revisions. It was a closed book as far as they were concerned. Many congregations went ahead and adopted this principle in their own congregations, but it was tabled by the Article 2 study group in deference to the proposed UU values that were being introduced that year. So here we are. The new values were adopted at the 2024 General Assembly. The newest official expression and common statement of faith of our UU values include equity, generosity, interdependence, justice, pluralism, and transformation, with love at the center. What can that look like inside and outside of these church walls? Interdependence. I'm not going to read the whole statement. It's up there. I'm going to read the first line of each one. I do want you to notice, though, that in the second line of each of these values, the phrase, "we covenant." This is an action communication. One of the complaints of the old principles was they were great in theory, but they did not provide action. How do we show our values? Interdependent. We honor the interdependent web of all existence. An example of how we do that is we show up at public meetings to speak out against desalinization. We compost right here on our own property. And this is a perception of the old seventh principle, which seemed to only address nature and our environment. But when we talk about our interdependence, we are talking about all of life, all of us. And one of the things that we do here is we do our best to stay in covenant, and we work through issues respectfully. It doesn't always work as well as we hope, but we give it a good try. Okay, equity. We declare that every person is inherently worthy and has the right to flourish with dignity, love, and compassion. How do we do that? We work to make sure that our church building is more accessible by adding gender-inclusive language and facilities. We've added more accessible seating, and we're still working on other accessibility issues. Within our community, we help provide food for our unsheltered neighbors. Transformation. We adapt to the changing world. As we continue our lay-led messages, we strive to explore a wide variety of subjects, many of which give us opportunities for some deep inward reflection about our own biases. Pluralism. We celebrate that we all are sacred beings, diverse in culture, experience, and theology. Again, in our worship and our religious exploration, we open ourselves to exploring and having thoughtful dialogue about different faith traditions. This is a place where people are supported in following their own faith traditions. Generosity. We cultivate a spirit of gratitude and hope. Today, we're sharing our collection plate with the disaster fund for Hurricane Helene. We've also donated part of our collection to groups such as the Women's and Men's Health Services. Paying your pledge also counts. Got to keep the lights on. Little plug there for the stewardship team. Justice. We work to be diverse, multicultural, beloved communities where all thrive. And how we show up in our community, we actively participate in and hold events that promote rights for marginalized people. So there is the new graphic for our shared UU values. We can still honor our principles and sources. They don't go away. They're not in our Article 2 bylaws anymore, but they're not just going to disappear. The principles and sources are linear. Our values, as you can see, are circular. And as the Story for All Ages pointed out, we can keep widening the circle and keep including more and more people. To me, the circular vision makes those values more resilient and stronger. As you can see, all of these values are centered on love. And love is intertwined with all of the other values. Love connects us. In closing, I'd like to share this quote by the Reverend Victoria Safford the night before the final pre-vote at the General Assembly for 2024. However we vote, we put love at the center, unflinching, insistent. This free faith we so cherish reveres the past and trusts the dawning future more. We believe in evolution, unfolding always, not unraveling, and revelation is never sealed. Thank you.